Albert wrote to his brother.
The public has graciously selected me as its scapegoat to answer for its not yet having come to war.
The English aristocracy had never accepted the prince as one of their own. They sneered at his dress, the open-necked collar and the thigh-length boots he wore to go hunting. Not the English style at all. A letter to the Times wryly speculated on the reasons he was disliked by the upper classes.
He does not gamble, does not use offensive language, and does not keep an opera dancer.
The Queen suggested another.
It is that unbounded dislike in England of foreigners, which breaks out continually and is very painful.
A damaging rumor was circulated that Albert was secretly in the pay of the Russians.
Albert did not want war. He felt that whatever was going to happen could be settled peacefully. And when he tried to settle it peacefully, when he tried to get the nations to think in terms of a conference to end the war, he found that people saw him as pro-Russian. And at one point there was a rumor spreading about London that Albert had been arrested as a spy, and thousands of people went to the Tower of London to stare up and see where Albert was, peering out of a window perhaps, a barred window in the tower. Of course he wasn't there, this was nonsense, but it gives you an idea of how Albert was thought of at that time.
From somewhat more comfortable quarters in the royal palace of Windsor, the prince wrote to friends in Germany.
We might fancy we are living in a madhouse. The stupidest trash is babbled to the public, so stupid you would not give it to the pigs to litter in.
The madness against Albert passed, but not the fever for war. In March 1854, a British fleet sailed for the Black Sea with 30,000 troops. They joined French and Turkish forces in an attack on the Russian naval base of Sebastopol in the Crimea. With the outbreak of hostilities, Albert knew where his duty lay. He embarked for France to review the troops assembled for dispatch to the Crimea and cement the shaky alliance with the French Emperor. Charles Dickens was on vacation in France when he saw the two men riding past at the head of a troop of cavalry. Albert's diplomacy was a great success. Dickens saw bonfires lit all along the coast to celebrate the alliance between Britain and France. Dickens made his own contribution by lighting 120 candles in the window of his rented cottage on the cliffs above the English Channel. But in the Crimea, there was little to celebrate. It had been 40 years since the British Army had fought a major war. It was ill-prepared and worse led.
The army that went to the Crimea hadn't been in action in any meaningful way since the Battle of Waterloo 40 years before, but it was exactly the same. The weaponry, the training, the systems, everything was exactly the same as it had been during the Napoleonic Wars. The world had moved on since then, but the army hadn't. And Lord Raglan, who was the commander of the Victorian Army, had no military experience. He'd never commanded as much as a platoon. So they went out there, and practically everything that could go wrong went wrong.
A British officer described the conditions.
The men stand day and night in trenches full of water, holding their muskets in their cramped and half-frozen hands, the rain soaking the only clothes they have in the world, which once wet will remain damp forever in this climate.
The conditions of the troops was absolutely awful. That they had virtually no supplies, no medical backup at all. They were starving. They were running with lice. They had no tents. They lived in waterlogged trenches. It was a small, ghastly pre-run, if you like, of the Great War.
Britain's allies were better equipped and better nourished. A dragoon in the French army reported that the British were so desperate they would exchange their boots for something to eat.
We give them what we can. It is pitiful to see such superb men asking permission to gorge themselves on the dregs in our mess tins.
Dysentery and cholera swept the ranks, and disease was followed by fatal blunders on the field of battle. The Crimea witnessed the most memorable single fiasco in British military history, the charge of the Light Brigade. The Light Brigade was the finest cavalry force in Europe, but it was commanded by George Brudenell, Earl of Cardigan, who treated war as just another aristocratic hobby like fox hunting. He was sent a written order to recover some British cannon that had been seized by the Russians to his right.
Cardigan read this and looked around, and the only guns he could see were the Russian guns directly to his front and other Russian guns on either flank. So, being as he was a rather impetuous officer and not one endowed with brains, he decided to attack. His wonderful last line as he drew his sword was, "Here go the last of the Brudenells," because he was in no doubt that if they went into that valley, most of them weren't coming out. And it was a total shambles.
Cardigan led the Light Brigade into the wrong valley, a valley lined on three sides with Russian artillery. The carnage was described by his men in flashes of horrific detail.
We advanced at a gallop amid a fearful fire from front, left and right of grape, shell and canister. Horses and men fell thick and fast.
Bleeding objects in one's path. Sometimes a man, sometimes a horse.
They were cut to pieces. They did actually reach the Russian guns and killed the Russian gunners. And all around, on the slopes, people were watching, aghast, with their hands over their eyes.
Of the 600 men who charged into the Valley of Death, barely half rode back alive. 30,000 troops had been sent to the Crimea. Within a year, 2/3 were dead or wounded. For the first time in the history of conflict, the suffering of the men and the failings of the generals were described in graphic detail to the public at home. For the Crimea introduced the world's first war correspondent, William Russell, of the London Times.
The noblest army ever sent from these shores has been sacrificed to the grossest mismanagement. Incompetence, lethargy and stupidity reign, revel and riot in the camp before Sebastopol and in the hospitals of Scutari.
Among the millions who read Russell's dispatches was the embittered Indian envoy Azimullah Khan. As a result, he decided to make a detour on his way back to India to see for himself what was happening to the British Army in the Crimea. He toured the hospitals where a woman called Florence Nightingale was fighting to save the lives of the British wounded and bring some order to the chaos. Even in the slums of London, Azimullah had never seen the British brought so low. It reinforced his belief that they were far from invincible. On his return to India, Azimullah faced an uncomfortable meeting with Nana Sahib. He had failed to win back the prince's titles and pensions, and he had spent lavishly of his master's funds. But Azimullah had rehearsed an argument that he hoped would save him from Nana Sahib's displeasure. The British were finished, he claimed. All they needed was a final push, and then the disinherited ruler could take all that was due to him, and more. He could exact a savage revenge for all the humiliations heaped upon him by the East India Company. Over the next few months, Azimullah's agents joined other dissident Indians in a campaign of rumor and subversion. They fanned the smoldering resentment aroused by the evangelists who appeared to threaten the sacred beliefs of Hindu and Muslim alike. They whispered that the British had been defeated in the Crimea and that a Russian army was now advancing on India. None of this was true. It was the Russians who had been defeated. But the rumor was widely believed. The British agents of the East India Company were puzzled and alarmed. As tensions rose, they tried to keep their fears from their families. But their only security rested in the native troops of the East India Company. Sikhs, Gurkhas, Pathans, Hindus, and Muslims. By the 1850s, their ranks had swollen to over 260,000. More than 10 times the number of British soldiers stationed in India, and more than twice the size of the entire British army around the world. Their loyalty was vital if the British were to remain in India. And in the wake of the Crimean War, the company made a seemingly trivial decision that would prove disastrous. Sneered at his dress, the open-necked collar and the thigh-length boots he wore to go hunting. Not the English style at all. A letter to the Times wryly speculated on the reasons he was disliked by the upper classes.
He does not gamble, does not use offensive language, and does not keep an opera dancer.
The Queen suggested another.
It is that unbounded dislike in England of foreigners, which breaks out continually and is very painful.
A damaging rumor was circulated that Albert was secretly in the pay of the Russians.
And at one point there was a rumor spreading about London that Albert had been arrested as a spy, and thousands of people went to the Tower of London to stare up and see where Albert was, peering out of a window perhaps, a barred window in the tower. Of course he wasn't there. This was nonsense. But it gives you an idea. Albert did not want war. He felt that whatever was going to happen could be settled peacefully. And when he tried to settle it peacefully, when he tried to get the nations to think in terms of a conference to end the war, he found that people saw him as pro-Russian.
Albert wrote to his brother.
The public has graciously selected me as its scapegoat to answer for its not yet having come to war.
The English aristocracy had never accepted the prince as one of their own. They